The weaponization of the tactics that MAGA extremists are using are intentional. Thanks to patriarchy and its effectiveness in keeping people obedient and silent, you are acquiescing your power to it when you don't understand how it is preventing you from releasing that power and the harm that it's caused, but also empowering you to come and step forth into your life and say, no, the time for this to be dismantled and for us to heal individually and collectively is now, right now. This is that time in history.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Welcome back, everybody. I'm so happy that you are here on this journey of connection and exploring connection and spirituality and religion and politics and all of the things leading up to this election. I cannot tell you how excited I am to bring this guest to you. Rev Karla Kamstra is here with us, and she is incredible. And we are going to be talking today about patriarchy. So let me introduce you formally to Rev Karla. She is a deconstructed Southern Baptist, an ordained interfaith minister, and a spiritual mentor, helping those who are deconstructing find healing and spiritual clarity. Her first book, which is going to be amazing, Deconstructing, Leaving Church, Finding Faith, will be out in October. She has a huge following online with over 700,000 followers on TikTok at Rev Karla. Rev Karla's content is a call for all seeking clarity beyond religious confines, which I love. It's exactly what I love too. She explores topics from deconstructing Christianity, healing religious trauma, the spiritual but not religious path, yes, and the dangers of Christian nationalism, which of course is so hot right now. She is breaking down barriers and creating a more inclusive and compassionate world. So true. And also, Rev Karla happens to have attended the same interfaith, interspiritual seminary as me. And so I'm so excited to be connecting with her in general because I love her work and her compassionate, supportive, but also a little bit badass energy. So welcome, Karla. I'm so excited for you to be here.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah. So before we get into talking about patriarchy, can you explain a bit about your background and how you ended up here as a quote unquote deconstructed Southern Baptist and what that means to you and sort of like the time frame? How long has it been since you left the formal church? Just give us a little bit of backstory so that our guests can get to know you and connect with you.
Sure. It's funny when I saw that you had said something about how I ended up here, because I have that question in my book. How did I end up here? Because I was such the good Christian. I only saw myself in that. It wasn't until I officially left the church that I could look back and see that the places in my path where I was questioning and I guess symbolically leaving, I just hadn't put all the pieces together. That started even back when I was 9 years old, sitting in the pew and listening to that fire and brimstone Southern Baptist preacher saying, you cannot be a preacher if you're a woman, while I'm sitting up beside a woman who was telling me I could be whatever I wanted to be and trying to reconcile that in my mind. So little by little, those breadcrumbs just came together to finally show me that this was not this God, this divine energy I was finding inside organized religion, especially my evangelical fundamentalist Christian background was this was just too small. This box was too small. And when I say that, that really makes people mad, but that's my experience. And so I had to leave and explore what this meant. But even when I left, I didn't see that I was leaving Christianity, but the organized part of Christianity. I thought I was just in the wrong church until I realized that, and it was in the middle of seminary, that I actually realized that I needed to let go of this notion that I was going back to church. I knew I wasn't.
So you went to Interfaith, interspiritual seminary, feeling that you were continuing on a Christian path. And so were you just curious, or like, how did you end up there if you really thought that you were continuing on your church journey?
That's a really good question, because there was a part of me that knew that I wanted to do something in some kind of ministry, but I didn't know what. But in the traditional Christian seminaries, I was finding this, especially coming from my faith. So if you're looking at some kind of Christian, established fundamentalist Christian background, first of all, they weren't going to ordain me as a minister. Secondly, I was going to have to sign a statement of faith that I no longer believed.
Got it.
And I knew I wanted to understand this God through the lens of a more universal language, description, experience. And I was going to be brave enough to go there, because I think intuitively I knew that there was room at the table for who I was as a Christian. But I'll have to tell you, and I'm not going to give out too many secrets here with my seminary siblings, but there were many of us who were covertly there that first year. We had not, my family, they just assumed when I said I was in seminary that I was at a Christian seminary. I just didn't tell them because I knew this was going to be an awkward conversation.
Oh, wow. Okay, got it. It was all very on the DL.
It was. And as I expected, there are family members who no longer speak to me because I'm an ordained interfaith, interspiritual. So without saying that I have rejected my Southern Baptist, the work I did, it precedes me. It's out there in front of me and says who I am and what I believe. And of course, I'm very much an activist in that role, helping people deconstruct, but also heal from the harm that kind of teaching, but also from the privilege, this privilege that we sit with, that we don't even realize that we, that's the hardest work right there. And I don't want to get too sidetracked there, but.
No, it is. It's good. Yeah. And hopefully you will come back on and we can talk more about that, because I think it's so important. And I did mention in the last episode when I was talking with Brian Recker that so many people know now that we live in a white male dominant society, but we also live in a white male dominant Christian society. And that is not the way that it is meant to be. Let's be clear. And that's obviously what is trying to be pushed even more with Christian nationalism. But I really appreciate you bringing up the privilege piece, because I think as white-bodied people, it is so important for us to recognize that and the privilege that we have. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. And I hope that we will revisit it on another episode. Just so that people have the context, Karla, because you have developed quite a ministry. And I know that it's been a journey, as it should be and as it's meant to be. But when did this happen? When were you covertly in seminary? How long ago was that?
So I started my seminary journey in 2015. I started out at a traditional Bible college. And a year into that, I'm like, I know this stuff. I live this stuff. I was teethed on John Hagee and Oral Roberts and all of those televangelists, Jimmy Swaggart. I mean, I grew up with them on Gospel Sunday mornings all throughout my childhood. And I hardly ever missed a revival or Wednesday night Bible study, all of it. It was me. That was my life. I started in 2015 and really started to reclaim my spirituality my final year of seminary. And I didn't know what that was going to look like. I didn't know. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag here a little bit, because honestly, when I went to seminary, I thought the primary goal of that seminary was going to be for me to understand and respect the many ways that people experience the divine. And yes, we absolutely walked away from that. But what they don't tell you is how much you change.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How much you're going to do the inner work.
Mm-hmm.
And, that I don't want that to deter anyone listening to this, because it was the hardest work I ever did in my entire life. But it was literally life-changing.
Yeah, it's also
me.
The most essential work that we do, I think, as ministers, is doing that deeper work to find our own clarity, but also to weed through the muck of all of the things that have been holding us back or keeping us small or making us try to be bigger than we are, or whatever it is, right? However that shows up for different people. So I appreciate that was quite a journey for you, and especially coming from where you came from. Karla, where did you grow up? Because you're Southern Baptist denomination, but that doesn't always mean that you lived in the South. So where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, Kentucky, God's country.
So, yes, South.
So it is. Yeah. So that very much is my experience. My grandfather was a dairy farmer in the beautiful rolling hills of Kentucky. And then my parents, when they married, we migrated north to southern Indiana. And now I'm a South Central Indiana gal. I've been here most of through elementary school and things, but I spent all summers up until my teen years in Kentucky. So I was born in Louisville. And so I kind of migrated north a little bit, but no, that little twang is still in there. It'll come out every once in a while.
I like it. It's sweet.
Yeah, somebody with a hillbilly ear can hear it. It's in there.
I love it. It's great. It's great. There are so many people who are starting to question some of the practices of the church, and I think especially the patriarchal practices, which is what we're going to talk about. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing to support people in that journey, because some people are just starting to question and some people are deeper on that journey. So you're such an important resource for people, and especially because you can have empathy and direct understanding from your own personal experience of going through this transformation. And specifically for me as a person, I consider myself spiritual, but not religious, or I just say I'm spiritual or interspiritual. But I really appreciate that you have really owned that that's the path that you're on and that you help people living that path.
Yeah. And this might, obviously, I'm sure we don't have time for a lot of this today, but I feel like it does need to be said because, I was invited to the Christians for Kamala Zoom meeting. I was absolutely honored and floored because I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I give kudos to John Pavlovitz, who was one of the primary organizers, for reaching out to me because we are outliers in so many ways. But because I still hold on to walking the spiritual but not religious path, but I hold on to the tenets of my Christian identity because I did the work. And I can still be inspired by the stories of that resonate and helped me guide my path where I am now. But that just sends it's like bristle. It's like sandpaper to some really strong fundamentalist Christians, or even some of the progressives who sometimes speak over the spiritual but not religious, that don't realize they're doing it. So I think it's very important that we become more vocal about not only is this an option, it's a valid option and it's sacred and it's growing.
Yeah.
You better start paying attention to the people who are out here outside of the organized structure, because we are one of the fastest growing sectors of spirituality.
The nuns, quote unquote, nuns.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, it's NONES. So it's not nuns like Catholic nuns.
Exactly.
So those that are spiritual, but not religious, people who have some sort of spiritual experience or some form of belief that is spiritual in essence, connected to the divine, connected to something, they are beginning to grow and grow, which many of you probably know because there is, noticeably in our culture, a decline in religious engagement in some capacities. That's not the case everywhere, especially with fundamentalism and evangelicalism. But generally speaking, spiritual but not religious people are becoming much more prevalent in general. And actually, Karla, and again, we don't need to get into this right now, but I have had this sort of thought over time that I wonder, with this election, I see this election personally as part of a larger movement or larger transformation in our culture of moving from toxic individualism to collectivism and to taking care of one another as I believe that we are meant to, and to be more living in community than so isolated. And I also started to wonder, because there's this, this huge push of men trying to hold on to control, white men largely trying to hold on to control, and Christian men holding on to control. There's this interesting thing where it's like, okay, is that rising up because we are moving away from that so much and they're trying to hold on for dear life to stay in control of their control? And to the same degree, I've been wondering if with Christianity, is it possible that what is happening is that the toxic elements of Christianity and this fundamentalist movement are showing themselves so that Christians can be like, nope, that is not Christianity. That is not what is meant to be. That is not truth. And this is so toxic. And so we're going to move away from it. So my hope somehow is that there's a tipping point within the Christian religion as well that's going to move away from these toxic traits, toxic behavior, especially the patriarchal part, and move back towards the way of Jesus, right? But anyways, I'm waxing poetic, but that's just something I'm really curious about. Is it possible that these tipping points are two tipping points with the way that we're, living as a society, but also with religion, which I hope is true. So,
I think you're onto something. I call it, we are slowly walking our way to organized religion's day of reckoning, but also really what you're going to see is really granularly focused in America, which is America organized Christianity. Day of reckoning. I think that's where we are, and we are slowly walking our way to that.
Yeah, I love that. So, Karla, there are clearly so many topics that you and I would like to talk about. And hopefully you'll join us after the election so that we can dive into some of this. But I'd like to stay topical to the election for this podcast episode and what's at play in our society right now. And so today, because this is something that you're really passionate about and have lots of insight on because of your own experience, but also research and learning and your own path, we're going to talk about patriarchy, how it plays out in religious structures, particularly in evangelical Christianity and Christian nationalism, how it suppresses critical thinking, is intertwined with spiritual bypassing, which we've also talked about on the podcast, and then also leads to incredible religious trauma. Trauma in general is a major thing with patriarchy, but your sort of expertise is with religious trauma. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about how we can deconstruct patriarchal structures and influence by reclaiming the divine feminine. So let's start, just so that everybody's on the same page with this podcast, with the basics and define patriarchy for our listeners. So patriarchy is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. It's also a secondary definition of a system of society or government in which the father or eldest male is head of the family and descent is traced through the male line. So for the purposes of this conversation, is there anything that you want to add to this definition? I think we're more talking to the first definition about male power and not specifically about the lineage of being passed down through males, but that is also part of it, obviously part of what we're experiencing. But is there anything else that you want to add for context about what we're going to talk about with patriarchy specifically?
Sure. For context, I would add that, and I have this in the book, that if you have been raised here in America, you have been exposed to it, harmed by it, or benefited from it, especially if you are a white person.
Right.
And it goes beyond just women. It's a historically marginalized groups. And it does lead to where we are in this moment. The relevance of it is incredibly important. So that's all I need to add at this point.
I'm going to be really direct. Why are we talking about patriarchy right now on a podcast that's looking at the 2024 election through the lens of connection? Like, why is this important right now? What's coming up?
So one of my taglines that I say in a lot of my videos where I'm educating people is stay awake, use your voice, and vote. And so many people are using the excuse of being too triggered by the election, and especially some of the toxicity that's coming from the extremist MAGA kind of thought and rhetoric and vitriol, that they use that as an excuse to turn away from it. I want them to stay awake and understand that that trigger is an invitation to go into where the places are that you are actually in danger of responding to some of what is the intention of that extreme MAGA thought, which number one, they hope you do numb out, that you're not paying attention to fact. Number two, that you are so terrified that you don't vote because you just feel like both sides are bad. We hear this a lot, both sides are bad. Or that if you are that triggered, patriarchy has impacted your life in so many ways that even if you turn back into your life and understand that that has tendrils into how we show up in the world, how we view other people, how it impacts our relationships within our work, family, in any place where we have community, and even how we see ourselves.
Yeah.
So this tension that's happening in our country, the weaponization of the tactics that MAGA extremists are using are intentional. They know how to weaponize those patriarchal tactics in order to try to trigger you in those ways. And so thanks to patriarchy and its effectiveness in keeping people obedient and silent and conforming to this structure that's intended to protect the power of the white Christian man, you are acquiescing your power to it when you don't understand the emotional response that you're having and how it is preventing you from releasing that power and the harm that it's caused, but also empowering you to come and step forth into your life and say, no, the time for this to be dismantled and for us to heal individually and collectively is now, right now. This is that time in history. So it's so important to understand the relevancy on a personal level, but also collectively, what's happening.
It's such a big concept, Karla, right? And it's something that we have been living within so much that it's sometimes hard for us to see how it's impacting us. And there's clear experiences for people who are in patriarchal churches, in family dynamics where this is playing out very real time. But I think it's so important for listeners to understand that it's hard to see it because we're inside it. It's easier to see when you're outside it looking in, which is why a lot of people who are not inside it, who are on the margins, do have a different perspective and a clearer understanding of this. And I want to make sure that people on the podcast understand that what Karla is talking about is us making an impact, right? The time is now. It is time to make a change. And that change can be as little as voting, right? As showing up and voting. Andrew Zaro was on one of the first episodes of this podcast, and he said something that I cannot get out of my mind, which is that apathy is the downfall of democracy. And that's exactly what, Karla, you're talking about here, about how this is one of the tactics, is that if people become apathetic, that actually works and helps people stay in control. And so one quote unquote small way, and it's not always small for people to be able to get to the polls when it's not a paid holiday. And so that's the small thing that you can do, is voting. And then there are so many more things that Karla is going to talk about, or that we're going to talk about today. But just make sure that you're listening and noticing if anything resonates with you today that helps you to understand your own experience and the experiences of other people, and maybe even have empathy for people and find ways to help them if they are really entrenched in a patriarchal system. So, Karla, specifically, because you have so much knowledge around this, talk to us about how this relates to religion and your expertise or experience with conservative Christianity. Can you share with us some of how patriarchy and patriarchal influences show up in these religious structures, Christian or otherwise, especially right now? That's such a hot topic because of Christian nationalism and seeing people in these churches. And I think especially white women. There are so many women who are voting, it seems, to their own detriment, which is confusing. So can you explain some of how this is playing out with patriarchal systems?
Absolutely. So I'd like to start with talking a little bit about what you're seeing inside this MAGA extremist system is this concept of the Christian ordained leader. So if you've seen some of the language used around Trump, and now a little bit with J.D. Vance, who definitely likes to infuse his religious heritage that came from his, what he calls his hillbilly background,
right,
and also now his Catholic associations, the male leadership is considered divinely ordained. And the way patriarchy works inside that Christian structure is when that has been communicated to the faithful, then you understand part of your indoctrination, you as the congregation, the members, understand that you protect that leadership because you have no authority or right to question that ordained label. So within the Christian leaders, you can expect mistakes, as they call them. They're only human. And the congregation has no choice but to forgive them. Now, we build a bridge over to Donald Trump. And there's even been a song out about how he's imperfect. He's just a man. He does silly things. He says silly things, but he's ordained by God. This kind of rhetoric is intentional because what they're trying to do is remind the evangelical base and those who have some kind of patriarchal indoctrination that they should not be questioning the fact that Donald Trump is the chosen one. And church leaders are telling you as such, so do not question this. So you have people who then all of a sudden are triggered and confused because they're hearing the messages that say, I'm worried about my children and my grandchildren, but yet that's my pastor telling me to vote for this person because he's ordained by God, even though I see all the horrific things.
So, Karla, I just want to be really clear because this is interesting language that you're using and people may not understand it. I don't totally understand it because I'm not from this background. So what does it mean for a pastor or church leadership and now Donald Trump to be quote unquote ordained by God? What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so happy to explain that. So yeah, because you are talking about what is I want to say a small subset, but it really isn't. Southern Baptist Convention is still the largest evangelical denomination of Christianity inside America. So when you can ignite them to vote, you can see what happened because it happened in 2016.
Right.
So a long time ago, the church, meaning the church organized by men,
right, the governmental body that was a church.
Exactly. Saw the advantage of creating a lineage around that protected the white Christian man by creating this language that said, as Jesus is the Son of God, and we now need to create this conduit so that people understand how important their relationship is to church, and that their activism inside church, their money, their tithes, all of that, the work that they do, the free labor that they give is tied to their salvation. And inside that language also is language that says the church leadership, who you don't question, who you don't know how they vote, you don't even know how much the pastor is paid in a lot of these situations. You give your money and they don't share what happens with the finances.
Zero transparency.
This is pervasive in a lot of these evangelical, fundamentalist, conservative. Those three words are used interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. A lot of times you'll see the difference between a welcoming church that will welcome people, but also gatekeep on how much they can actually participate in leadership and things like that. You're not going to see them officiating a same-sex marriage, even though they brand it differently. Conservative or fundamentalists will say, don't even come to our door. You're a sin, don't even come to our door. But they all kind of fit into this bucket where the finances, the decisions made about leadership, all of that is kept behind closed doors where it's all men making the decisions for the church. And so that language comes through that leadership. And then they then will vote on a pastor. And sometimes it's just as close as the pastor's son or relative or whatever. And then that person is elevated to the leadership or to the pastor, headship. And so then you have this narrative that these men who have been chosen as elders of the church, you do not question their leadership. And because they are guided by God, they've chosen a pastor who is now protected, is here to shepherd the flock, but he is also protected by that flock. A perfect example of this is a couple of years ago.
Familiar.
Yes, of course it does. And a couple of years ago, I mean, especially with TikTok, has been really good about, if you find one of these on your For You page, the algorithm will tell you several stories. But several years ago here in Indiana, there was a pastor who got caught having a relationship with an underage person. And it was what it was. I mean, it was assault, it was grooming, and it was rape. He got up and said it was an inappropriate affair. This woman stood up out of the congregation and said, "No, you groomed me. I was your babysitter. I was 16 years old." And she had the nerve at the end of this experience. You can see it all on video. One or two people are seen hugging, who's now a woman. The entire congregation surrounds the pastor to pray for him.
Oh, God.
So you're seeing the visual contrast. This is it in real time. This is exact narrative and training and indoctrination for anybody who is exposed to that side of Christianity that the playbook of MAGA is relying on. So when you see all these AI-generated images with Trump and the Jesus's hand on him or an angel protecting him, this is all to invoke that patriarchal indoctrination to tell Christians that he is God ordained.
And God ordained to me, from what you're saying, Karla, is like chosen by God. Like the idea is that these people are put in these positions, quote unquote, they're voted into these positions. But what the language actually means for people who are in these systems and in these communities is that this person is chosen by God. They are fallible because they are human, but no matter what, they are chosen by God and must be forgiven, and everything must be allowed, which is exactly what Trump is trying to do, despite not even being a Christian.
Exactly.
Which is wild to me. But exactly what you're saying is exactly what's playing out with Trump. It's like the Supreme Court is like the church leadership who's choosing, like, okay, yeah, you can, have all these felonies and you will never be held accountable. It's like, wait, what? Like, how? Okay. Huh? Makes no sense. Exactly. Fascinating. Yeah. Okay. How does that play out for people in terms of if someone is in one of those churches or in a Christian nationalist or a Southern Baptist, whatever, in one of these situations, say you were a member of the church. And so for you or anybody that is a listener for you, how does that play out for them? What are they experiencing and what are the implications as a member of that church?
Well, I think what's really happening, especially for women in this situation, you're starting to find, as people are, quote, falling away from this type of system, they're understanding how much they've been harmed by it. So if you're deconstructing, let's say you're in the deconstructing bucket or the journey or the path, you are triggered by some of what you're seeing, and you're this outrage. When I'm teaching, I want to help you turn that outrage into activism and understand where the source of your rage is coming from, because more than likely you're responding to the very tactics that have been used in the past somehow, either to harm you, you witnessed it, it silenced your voice. It silenced the voices of the historically marginalized. You heard it in sermons. So let's get past that so that you can now move into activism, making sure that you vote, and also turning back to your life, a better version of yourself. Because if you can let that go and understand how much it harmed you, how it tainted the way you viewed the world and others. Because it's not just how it harmed you, it is how you view the world. You often will wield this moral or spiritual superiority because, as you said, so many of those that have been harmed by patriarchy are actually voting against their interests because they have made their way a little bit up that patriarchal structure and they're going to protect it. So they'll lug that water up to pour it down on anybody else who threatens the structure that what they perceive that they've worked so hard to become loyal to. They can't imagine their life any other way than to be close to this patriarchal, those within that patriarchal power. And they are threatened by those who want to see it dismantled.
Who want to see the whole system dismantled.
Exactly.
So they're like continuously sort of moving up the ladder, if you will, whether it's spiritual or social standing status, whatever it is in a church. I would imagine that plays out pretty significantly. And so they continually move up that ladder, but they don't want the entire ladder to be broken because it's the only life that they know, which makes sense. So there is some empathy there. And what is interesting about what you're talking about to me, Karla, is, this idea of like, okay, I'm going to believe what I'm told. Right? I'm going to do what I'm told. There's definitely a lack of agency and autonomy that comes with that. And so people who are in those systems are basically being told, like, your pastor knows better than you do and knows better than everybody does. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
You turn over personal agency. I mean, I remember taking pretty serious life decisions to pastors in my past. People are often like, you like, oh yeah, waiting until, and then, receiving that biblical type counseling where scripture was your only path, your only way you were going to get decisions. And of course it was never going to point you out of loyalty to this patriarchal structure. It was always about turning you back in because they rely on the free labor and the tithing in order to perpetuate this institution. One of the most dangerous in this system is the white Christian woman.
Yes.
And
100%.
That's really hard to hear because oftentimes that is the person I have to block. The second most common person I have to block is the deconstructing white Christian woman who will not face her entitlement and how she's still wielding it in the deconstructing community and how she is dangerous.
Yeah. Explain for listeners why they are so dangerous. Like, what is the threat there?
So easily you can look out and see on the opposite end of the spectrum, a Marjorie Taylor Greene. And you can look at that and see, or this Laura Loomer that everybody's talking about, you can see like that's just a radicalized version of someone who is going to be, quite frankly, dangerous. And she's embedded into that patriarchal system, even though she has no chance whatsoever of being elevated to the most prominent place in power. And even though they're given power, as long as they work in cooperation of protecting the patriarchal structure, they will be protected within that structure. But let's say a white Christian woman comes out of that and says, I'm done with this system and I'm going to deconstruct. And they don't necessarily put any type of structure and intention behind that deconstructing. In other words, they think just leaving the system is all they need to do. When in reality, we got a lot of unpacking to do.
Right.
So we have to learn not only what parts how we were harmed, but how we benefited. And we do that by listening to those who have been harmed most by Christianity in this country. So we learn about all of that. So a person who hasn't done that still wants to be the loudest person in the room, still wants to come in and advise in a way that shuts the voices of other people who have not only things to say, but are more than likely more on path of the truth. And when you offer a mirror to them on what is happening, it violently gets knocked out of your hand. And this has happened more than one occasion. And I to the point where I've had to stand in that truth to say, look, I'm going to let y'all know I have to protect this space from people who are deconstructing, but also people who have been from the historically marginalized community who trust me to hold this space
100%.
and allow them and amplify their voices. So that's what I mean by that. And it's so important to be able to look in that and realize that we've got a lot of work to do. I'll never not be deconstructing for the rest of my life.
Yeah, it also feels like the white Christian woman is also an incredible asset to white Christian men.
Oh, for sure.
I will say, because they then indoctrinate more women, because there is a lot of separation in between men and women, and obviously marginalized communities, which are not accepted in many of these communities, which is wild to me still. And so generally speaking, I think that women indoctrinating women in a system that doesn't benefit women is just terrifying. Yeah. And generally speaking, what I see is that anybody who is not a white Christian man, who is at the head of the house or head of the organization or whatever it is, there is an incredible lack of trust, it's self-trust that becomes inherent in that, because these systems are teaching people that someone else knows themselves better than they do. So somebody else who is quote unquote ordained by God, or maybe is their husband, who in these systems has more authority and is more valuable than you, knows what you need more than you do, knows what is important more than you do, knows your body more than you do and what it needs. There's just this sort of like rip the rug out, or don't even have a rug in the first place, that you have autonomy, you have self-agency, you have your own beliefs, you have your own religious experience. Like, you are connected to divine energy. You don't have to go through some middleman who has been decided upon by a corporate structure, basically, to put that in between so that they can benefit. And so that is terrifying to me, and just so upsetting that these people, mostly women, are really struggling because they don't even see it, right? And that's what's so powerful about this indoctrination, is you don't see it. And so it's these rigid gender roles that people don't understand. They don't understand what they're experiencing or why it's affecting them the way that it is, or that it is affecting them in any way. But for women to be giving their power over to men is infuriating.
It's
infuriating. So yeah, sorry, I'm just on a soapbox.
It's a good one. And one of the things you more than likely are going to get someone that's going to email you and say, not all white Christian women. And I just want to say to the person who's feeling that right now as you're riled, is that is a really good indication that you are exactly who I'm talking about. I want to say that with as much love as I can, but when you can't separate yourself from the fact that we have benefited from this very system, and because it's still in existence, we always have to recognize the fact that if we are working for the good of the whole, we must be mindful about how we show up. And the way we show up is not by demanding that the work that we're doing be the first thing that comes through the room. No one's going to pat you on the back for the work that you're doing. The not all Christians and the not all white women need to understand that that is a good indication that there's still some work to do, because that edge of defensiveness is where your growth is. And so I just want to invite those of you who feel that a little bit in some of the words we say is really an invitation to dive into this work and see where you're still holding on to some things that it's time to let go of. Because I know what's happening. I know what's happening right now.
Yeah. And I think it's also important. I know that it's hard, right? And this becomes also a conversation about white fragility, because we have, as a whole, benefited immensely from being white. I am a white cisgender person, as are you. And so we have benefited immensely from living in a society where we are not as marginalized as some people are, right? And so that said, there's a lot of white fragility, and maybe there's even Christian fragility. I've never actually heard someone say that, but I I feel like it's kind of real. And so having empathy for people that they are going to be looking at things that are hard to look at, right? And looking at how we have benefited from a system that was built to benefit us. And so having empathy for people in those moments, but also I think your point is so important, which is that there's also this hero complex that comes up like, I'm doing the work, I'm deconstructing, or I'm doing the work, I'm helping with decolonization or whatever. And it's like, yes. And I say this from a place of having this happen with me sometimes too. Like we like to be seen for the work that we're doing, but it's not really the point. So I really appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, Karla. And I'm sending both love and hope for continued change for people who have been stuck in these systems, because it is really toxic what they have been through. And I know that you also talk about how these patriarchal systems do lead to religious trauma, and especially this whole thing with like the spiritual bypassing stuff that happens with it, like praying away your pain, and it just feels gross. So I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah.
The trauma or the bypassing. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll start with the bypassing because I do think this also ties back to the relevancy of what's happening right now. And that is another thing brought to you by Patriarchy, which is this thing not only about Trump being ordained by God to be the leader of the country right now, but also that he's protected. And the attempted assassination that occurred several weeks ago, and using that language about how he was protected, even though there were deaths that day. Or at the same time, people are holding space for dying children whose prayers aren't getting answered. And you have, right now you have a whole family who's grieving the loss of their loved one and whose pain is now out of the limelight because Trump goes on with that magnanimous, divine ordered playbook that they put around him. And yet you have this firefighter's family who's grieving outside of the public eye because the narrative must be focused on the fact that Trump was protected. So this hypocrisy about the power of prayer and why some aren't answered and why some are is something that this awakening has no tolerance for. I see it so often that even people that find comfort and find their spiritual path inside organized religion are pushing really hard back on this active power of prayer, being that Jesus is going to intervene on behalf of this man who doesn't even know how to say 2 Corinthians and said something like 2 Corinthians because he's never had to say it. He's never opened the book before in his life.
Right.
And yet you have people who've been praying and on their knees for months and sometimes years for the pain and the suffering of their loved ones, of children, and nothing changes. Or you talk about people who prayed for when the hurricane and they protected Mar-a-Lago when the hurricane was coming in a couple of years ago, and yet people lost their lives and all of their, and they can't afford hurricane insurance anymore, so they lost everything that they own. And you have this kind of bypassing to say, I am so indoctrinated into that narrative that I'm going to continue to just keep gulping down this patriarchal language and thinking that God, that somehow I'm going to be high-fived when I get in heaven because I protected this kind of Trump theology, if you will, that's been created by this narrative. So it's very harmful, and it's something that, like I said, as people are getting less tolerance for this type of spiritual bypassing, now that alone leads to religious trauma. And that was one of the things that when I first started deconstructing, that I had to realize how much I was hurting. That it wasn't just I felt bad because of all this anger I felt. And the fact that I could no longer even use the word God. I refused to, because the only God that I thought existed was this patriarchal, anthropomorphized, pissed off God sitting on a bench somewhere that was zapping my favorite sports team to win and my favorite parking space. And somehow one child in one bed lives and another child in another hospital bed dies. And I didn't want anything to do with that God. And it was through my journey with not only my spiritual mentors that I had, including a wonderful shaman who said something about a time that I would walk this path and help people. I'm like, what are you talking about? What path am I walking? I just want to get out of church. But also seminary, helping to get to that point where I could release that anger and understand that in order for me to claim my seat at the table of humanity and spirituality, it didn't require me to come to this place of gatekeeping. Because that was the only way I understood spirituality, was if you didn't believe XYZ, you were going to hell and you didn't belong. That's the way. If you weren't part of the exclusive Christian club, you were not part of the faithful and you were not part of the chosen. That was my heritage. And I did not realize how much that had harmed me, not only how I viewed the world, but how much that harmed me about what I believed in myself. I was out here without a roadmap. And then understanding when somebody first told me, you have trauma related to some of these stories that you shared. And, therapists look at you with those big eyes and said, your pastor did what? Your pastor did. And he said, what? Your church members did what? And you're like, isn't that common in other churches? No.
Isn't that normal?
It's not. And so most people don't recognize that their pain is valid because the church teachings taught them that it isn't. You're always pointing away. I mean, not kidding. It's very common that many of us had the experience of you don't need Prozac, you need Jesus. Pray the headache away. Any kind of physical ailment meant that you had a weak faith, that you didn't pray enough. That if you didn't receive the miracle of healing, then there was something wrong with your faith, that you needed to pray harder. You needed to go. And of course, that's going to lead to trauma, especially when you look at the people who have been so harmed, who are physically disabled, the people who struggle with mental health challenges. You are looking at a large swath of people walking around with religious trauma and they don't even know it. They think God is mad at them. And they think that because they don't go to church anymore because it was too painful, but they still think that they're going to some hell because of that. So religious trauma is really still, it is a powerful weapon that the patriarchy uses. And we have to figure out how to help people see that and understand that their pain is valid. So there are more therapists who are becoming trauma informed. I make it very clear, first of all, I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm a segue. I help people understand that this could be a challenge in your life. Let's find a therapist who can help you. And then if there's spiritual care that I can offer and guidance, let's complement that work together. So that's how I use it. But it's so important when you are releasing patriarchal indoctrination of your religious history, your religious heritage. There always comes a place where we have to say, how did church hurt you? How did this teaching hurt you? Because more than likely, if it doesn't go to the level of trauma, which your therapist can help label, there is more than likely some kind of spiritual manipulation, spiritual manipulative tactics, spiritual abuse somewhere in your past that you deserve to heal from and let go.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does patriarchy, I know this is a huge question to answer quickly, but how does this affect people who are not in those systems? How is this playing out? Obviously, we see what's going on with Trump, but how is it playing out for people who are not necessarily in these deep Christian, conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical communities?
I wish people did understand it more, because I think that then the communications and the strategies that we're using related to talking to people would change. For instance, one of the most powerful things I think is happening right now is this campaign of saying your husband doesn't need to know who you vote for. Jostling the woman who is submissive and understands that she does have a voice, but she's more than likely married to a man who's telling, if he's indoctrinated into that ideology, that he doesn't even think she should have the power to vote. She does have the power to vote, and she can go. So how we strategize to talk to the indoctrinated would change if we understand the indoctrination.
Right.
So just saying they're crazy and they're in a cult, there's certainly cult-like behavior. I can admit that.
Right.
But it doesn't, you're dismissing a whole large swath of people who are capable and in the middle of the night are questioning why they're involved. It is a very small subset of the loyals who are actually a part of this.
Right. And so that means to me, for people who are listening, if you know someone and you've written them off as like, there's no way that that person has anything other than their husband's beliefs in mind or whatever it is, first of all, don't make assumptions, right? Be curious and not judgmental. Have a conversation with someone. And also, even if it doesn't feel like they're responsive, even just being kind to them and saying like, hey, you know, do you want to go vote? You can do whatever feels good for you, but it's your vote. And like, hey, here's why I'm voting for who I'm voting for. It doesn't have to be a fight. It doesn't have to be anything, but don't count someone out. Don't ignore them and don't just put them in a bucket that maybe they don't belong in. So don't make those assumptions. And I think that's so helpful, Karla. So final question for you is about how do people start to untangle from this? I know that the divine feminine is something that you care about and has been helpful for you. And so explain that a little bit, how reclaiming the divine feminine or reconnecting with the divine feminine can help to allow people to deconstruct, but also can help our society in general. Big fan of the divine feminine over here, but yeah.
So, and I actually forgot that we were going to talk about that. And it might require a part two, but one of the things that you have to see inside being anti-patriarchy is not being anti-masculine. It is anti-toxic masculinity.
Correct.
But for those of us who work in this, especially in the spiritual work realm, and even though this gets a little mystical, we understand that there's a balance of healthy masculine and feminine traits. But inside patriarchy, anything that's feminine is pushed to the side because they fear it. They understand the wisdom behind it, especially as women mature. And we are no longer the caretakers of children, but we now can turn to, and I'm not saying that that's age requirement. I'm certainly not dismissing women who haven't had children or anything like that. I'm just talking about the age cycles of women, because oftentimes if we're not nurturing children, we're nurturing a project that we're bringing to life. We're birthing something that's a gift to the world. Exactly. And all of a sudden we become that, and it expands into the world into very powerful healing ways. That is us inviting that feminine energy to not only be celebrated and honored, but to rise up to the level of leadership that it deserves, because it is the balance that keeps things in order. If we had that in the past, for instance, if you look at our legislation representation, the demographics of America aren't represented as much in our government structures. It's still very much a white Christian men's world. That's a good example of how we are still protecting that patriarchy inside it. So that means that toxic masculinity is still at the front of that, because that's what patriarchy protects. So how do we move over to people who understand this masculine feminine energy that's invoked in each of us? So each of us carries both traits in us, and it doesn't mean that one has to be, some are prominent in others than it is. Like, for instance, yours might be different than mine.
Right.
Or it might show up in your lives in different phases. It doesn't matter how that looks, but we have to figure out a way to embrace it. So when you look throughout history, for those of you who are more interested in it, just type in the divine feminine and see how it's been honored, and also do research on how the language of the divine feminine has been silenced in the Bible.
And also, actually, I think that the divine masculine is also fascinating as well, because people associate masculinity with actually what is toxic masculinity, when in reality, divine masculinity is so powerful and wonderful and reverential and so many different things. And so looking at the traits of the divine masculine and divine feminine is amazing. And I'm actually trying to get someone on the podcast to talk about the rise of the divine feminine, which would be amazing. And it's not like femininity like femme. It's like the divine feminine, which is such a powerful part of our experience as humans and as women, but as humans in general. And we need to find a rebalancing because we are so out of balance. And I do think that having a woman president would be amazing in general, but also that it would help to start to reclaim some of the balance. And then also, like you're talking about, having women and people and non-binary people and trans people and people of color and all these marginalized people be represented. They actually have a lot more wisdom because they've actually gone through the things that have oppressed them, which also give them insight into what needs to change, and they live it. And so I think that that's a huge piece that we need to look at as well. And they are people who are exploring divine masculine and feminine and all of these things. So so much to learn. All right, Karla, I hope that we will chat again. Thank you so much for being here with me. Everybody, Karla has provided you all with lots of resources, including some of her spiritual guides. She has all these incredible things. You can find her on TikTok at Rev Karla and also on Instagram at Rev Karla. And she has a Facebook group. And so I will share the links to all of that in the show notes. And Karla, you are amazing. Thank you for the work that you are doing in the world. The divine feminine is rising in you, and we are so lucky that is happening. So.
Amen, sister. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karla. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. You can find all the resources mentioned in the show and even more resources in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Before you go, a note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and the work of The Connected Way, enhancing individual and collective connection to self, others, the land, and spirituality, you can donate on the podcast webpage. There is never any pressure or expectation, but if you feel called to support the work, any contribution of any amount helps, as do your good thoughts. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway from today's show. What inspired you? What surprised you or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment on any of the posts or DMing me on Instagram, or of course, you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.